Before we dive into historical trauma, it's important that we first have an understanding of trauma. We can define trauma as any event, experience, or perception that causes overwhelming and prolonged distress without the ability to cope or reconnect with oneself. Trauma affects how we interact with the world, especially in relationships with others, and most importantly, it affects the relationships that we have with ourselves. Let's break trauma down even further. Trauma can be broken down into two categories, known as either little t trauma and big T trauma. Big T trauma is seen and experienced as the result of a major event, such as a war, natural disasters, serious accidents, or something life-threatening. This is typically what we think of when we hear the word trauma. However, we can also experience what we call little t traumas. Little t traumas are more personal and distressing events that really anybody can go through at any point in their life, and they're often not life-threatening. They can be interpersonal conflicts, such as divorce. It can be chronic stress, chronic health issues, financial hardship, emotional abuse, unmet needs, or a loss of relationship. Experiencing either type of trauma can leave a person feeling helpless and powerless, while directly affecting their physical, emotional, and mental health.
We can define historical trauma as multi-generational trauma experienced by a specific cultural, racial, or ethnic group. This trauma is often related to major events that oppressed a particular group of people. This trauma is cumulative and it reverberates across generations. So descendants who may not have directly experienced that initial traumatic event can actually exhibit the signs and symptoms of trauma. Oftentimes, this looks like emotional and psychological wounding over the lifespan and across generations. Another way that we can look at historical trauma is that the sign of ultimate oppression working is when the oppressor can take away his hands, stand back, and say, look at what they're doing to themselves. And we can absolutely see this within the Native Hawaiian community.
So starting in the 1960s, knowledge of historical trauma emerged from stories of those who endured the Holocaust and its impact on the following generations, as well as experiences of Japanese Americans placed in internment camps after World War II. So both of these groups experienced mass trauma, and as a result, what was seen is that their children's mental health was directly affected by the traumatic events that their parents experienced. This new understanding laid the groundwork for future historical trauma research at that time. And other examples of historical trauma include slavery and the colonization of Native Americans.
So when we're looking at how does this display in a culture or in our society, we know that individual trauma histories are a part of a larger trauma narrative. And over time, this narrative may accumulate into multi-generational shared accounts of events that have really harmful effects on functioning and the quality of life. So some of the impacts of historical trauma will affect the family. Some people individually experience no effects of historical trauma, whereas other people might experience some really significant effects. Some individuals may experience poor overall physical and behavioral health, including low self-esteem, depression, self-destructive behavior, substance use and addiction, high rates of suicide, and even impacts to physical health. When people experience these types of challenges, we know that it impacts the rest of the family. So a parent's experience of trauma may disrupt their typical parenting skills and contribute to problems or concerns that we may see within children. And this compounds familial and intergenerational trauma. We often see this, especially with domestic violence and substance misuse in families. We also can see macro-level or community-level impacts of historical trauma. The persistent cycle of trauma destroys families and communities and threatens the vibrancy of entire cultures. Historical trauma often involves the additional challenge of a damaged cultural identity. So when an individual or families live in a community with unaddressed or unresolved trauma, oftentimes if they have issues that aren't directly linked to the historical trauma event, those issues can be exacerbated because of the unaddressed grief and mental health needs. We also know that at a community level, populations that have historically experienced mass trauma tend to have a higher prevalence of chronic disease several generations later. Historical trauma occurs at all levels: individuals, families, and communities. Although each level is distinct, they're all interrelated. So the way that trauma impacts an individual impacts a family, and that in turn impacts the entire community. We know that when individuals become more attuned or connected to their past, their present, and their future, it can help them to develop a sense of self and cultural identity as a result. This is going to be really crucial when we're looking at how we can heal from historical trauma. Every Native Hawaiian shares an experience of cultural and historical trauma, but also inherently cultural and historical resilience. So when a student walks into your room, they bring with them both the trauma and the resilience of their kupuna.